name is Susan Henderson with Placemakers, and I will be one of the faculty for the 202E SmartCode Calibration at CNU 21 this year, and we're glad that you're joining us, and would just like to give you an overview today of the Synoptic Survey, since we won't have the opportunity to go into the field and actually do a tour this year due to logistics. So we'll begin with this map that shows you all of the locations of the transect zones that we've selected as sort of Salt Lake prototypical T-zones. You see the CNU 21 logo there. That's the location of the venue where we'll be. So as you can see, a couple of them are within walking distance on South Main, but then the others are a little further afield. If you do get in early and want to check them out, you can do it via transit, but we just won't have time during CNU. Now, the T6 is the closest one. It's only a couple of blocks away up Main. T5 is another 3 blocks north of that in the city center, the City Creek area. The T4 Open is at 15th and 15th, which is a fair amount southeast of us. The general T4 is at the end of East Temple, and the T3 is just north of that in the avenues. But we will be sending you a link to this map so you can zoom in closer and look at the parcelization and the aerials and whatnot on Google. Or you can write down this link to the map directly, and I'll give you a moment to write that down. So we'll begin with T6, and attached is my email address so that if you have any questions on any of this, if you want greater detail, if you would like the Synoptic Survey app that I've used to do the survey so that you can access it directly on your iPad or your iPhone, just contact me at susan@placemakers.com. And so beginning with the T6, in Exchange Place, like we mentioned earlier, the way the app works, and we would recommend you do this even if you do your synoptic surveys the old-fashioned way with paper and pencil, is to locate them geographically by city, by state, by region, so that you'll be able to build your libraries over time. Then we note the transect zone that we're dealing with. Now the app is really great because you see the point where it says GIS data, and then if you actually click on that in the app, then it brings up the Google Maps, so you can go back and forth and cross-reference things based on the parcels and the aerials. You can also then export this directly to your GIS if you are with a municipality or local government. The first thing that we look at is the block size, length and width. Now, one thing you'll notice in Salt Lake is that the Mormon block is 660 by 660. And that's to the block, the facade face. This dimension is to the center line of the thoroughfare. I would imagine it was done by some students at the University of Utah, so I'm guessing that that's why it's noted as 700. The general parcel area in this particular block is only 3750, which is actually quite small. And interestingly enough, some of these larger floor plates that you see in the private frontage photo are actually spanning multiple historic blocks. Lot coverage is 100%, as you would expect, and there are alleys. We'll go through each column and then scroll down the page. So moving on to the public frontage, looking at the streets. These are commercial streets with on-street parallel parking, wide sidewalk of, we'll get to that in a moment, but the right-of-way width is 130 feet, which is also very normative for the Mormon block. There are 2 moving lanes, 2 parking lanes, pavement width of 86 feet, vertical curb with gutter, and a curb radius of 15 feet. So if you actually look, other than the width of the right-of-way, the other metrics of the thoroughfare are really quite good. The private frontage, we're seeing mostly shop fronts and common entries in this area. There are some civic buildings, some large office buildings that have the common entry, but you're seeing a whole lot of storefronts. The principal building height is 12 stories. There are no outbuildings, which is very common in T6, and all of these buildings are rear yards. So looking back at that in aerial, if you look in, you can look closely at these parcels that I was mentioning, the historic parcels that are quite small, and then the larger buildings tend to be typically on the corner of the blocks, although the U.S. Bankruptcy Court building takes up a full block face. Looking at it in aerial, it gives you a sense of how very large some of these buildings are. But just notice on the northeast block, the very, very small fine-grained buildings, and you'll see if you go into Street View that these are all one story, which is a little out of context given the general fabric. So moving on to the rest of those columns, back to the public frontage, the median width is 30 feet. This is a light rail line, and it's a perfect dimension for transit. The sidewalk width is 13 feet. Planters are raised tree planters, 8 feet square and 30 feet on center. So it's really good fabric for T6. There is a bike lane, and it's 6 feet wide. The columns are triple columns, which is interesting because it gives you the higher height for the vehicular lighting, and then the lower lamps are for the pedestrian lighting. The lighting height is 16 feet in general, and water meter and electric is all located in the rear. We tend to note all that, so in our ongoing conversations with utility departments, it gives us a little leverage. The general lot width ranges from 22 to 100 feet, although some of those parcels, if I were measuring them, I would have assumed that they were actually wider than that, particularly the one that was the court building. But once again, as I mentioned, this is student data, so perhaps they missed it. It could be that they were doing averages rather than really a survey. The frontage build out is 100%. All of the setbacks are 0, and there is, for the ground level uses, there's office and retail, and the upper level uses are office. The T5 that we're going to look at is in Provo, largely because even though there's the one I mentioned in City Creek, the urbanism there is, well, go look at it and then compare it to this Provo Synoptic Survey that I'm going to give you. It's going to be hard to get to Provo, but their Main Street is really a very good regional example of T5. Like I mentioned, there is the one in City Creek, just 4 blocks north of the venue, and I would urge you to go look at it while you're in town. This is what it looks like from street view. So although the fabric is fairly normative for what you would expect in T5 with on-street parking, 5 stories, vertical mixed use, and then the rail, if you look at it, it's interesting. For those of you who are in West Palm last year, you're going to see a similar difference between City Creek and the historic T5 that you saw in the City Place and the historic fabric of West Palm. So going through the survey of Provo, the block length is really nice here. It's a tight grid, 430 by 430, and average parcel size is 2,400 square feet. This is a commercial avenue, which is a little different. You're going to see the diagonal parking in the center rather than transit. The total right-of-way width is the common Mormon 130 feet, 4 moving lanes. Like I mentioned, diagonal parking, 94 feet of pavement width, which is pretty significant, and a 16-foot curb radius and a vertical curb. There is a median, and we'll get to those dimensions in a moment. The private frontage type, shop front and gallery. Principal building height, three stories, and they're all rear yard. So if you want to look at that in Google, which is on the map that we referenced earlier, you can see here how fine-grained it is. So this is West Center Street at North University Avenue, and although Center itself, perhaps we could critique that, and maybe we will when we meet. Overall, the fabric is really very nice and tight for a T5. So back to the avenue, the median width is 25 feet wide. Sidewalk width is 12 feet, great for T5. They're all tree wells, which are 4 by 4 and at 20 feet on center, which is really very nice. They're vase-shaped trees, good for T5 signage. There's a bike route, no bike lanes. Lighting are double columns at 12 feet, so very good for a pedestrian environment, and water and electric meters are both in the rear. The lot width, you're going to see a very significant range from 20 feet wide to 230, which is really quite good for flex building. Frontage build out, once again, is 100% and all setbacks are at 0. The encroachment in the front is at 10 feet. You'll notice when you do street view that there are a number of galleries on the street, which is really very nice. Side street encroachments are also 10 feet. Ground level retail exclusively, and upper level is office. So perhaps we could critique that it would be nice to have some second story residential, but that probably is a zoning issue. So moving to T4 open, like I mentioned, this is 15th and 15th, and really a nice little neighborhood center. I would encourage you, if you make any field trips, this would be a good one. The block length is 750 and the block width is 260. So this is where you start to, when you begin to get into some of the neighborhoods, you get away from the square blocks and get more into the elongated. The units per acre from our count was around 10. So it's a good T4, not tight, but respectable. The average lot area is 6,000 square feet, and the coverage is about 80%. It's a street. It does have on-street parking. The right-of-way width is 60 feet, so it's a good urban section. 2 moving lanes, 2 parking lanes, 40 feet of pavement, which is a little big, but it's fine. It does have a bike lane, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Vertical curb radius is really quite tight at 1 foot 2 inches. The private frontages, common yards, terraces, shop fronts, 1 story, so they could go another story or 2 and actually build a better sense of enclosure, but it really is quite good. So looking at that from Google, you can see these elongated blocks and the nice tight fabric of the parcels and the building footprints. And we are looking at this piece. It's referred to as Emerson, but it's really 15th and 15th. So back to the survey, sidewalk width is 4 feet, which is tight. There's a continuous planter, which is also 4 feet, and the tree types vary, which is not so unusual once you get into T4. There's a bike lane, 4 feet. Cobra head lighting, which is, not the best. It's also at 30 feet, so it's not very effective for the pedestrian. Water meters on the side and electric is in the back. The lot widths range from 18 feet to 80 feet. Frontage built out 100%. The front setbacks are all at 15 feet, which is pretty interesting because a lot of that is given over to terraces. So especially in a dining environment, that really isn't a bad use of that 15 feet. And then once you segue into the residential in the next block, then that feels like a competent T4 setback, although maybe a little generous. Side setback is 0. There's some attached building types here, and then the rear setback is 5 feet. Ground level retail and office, also residential, and there are no upper stories in this area. And then we'll go to the T3, which, as I mentioned earlier, is in avenues. If you want to see some nice residential area, I would also suggest this as a field trip. You can see from the images really quite charming neighborhoods. This is back to the 400-foot square block. So you can see, we talk a lot about the 660 Mormon block, but there's a fair amount of diversity within Salt Lake City and the region. The units per acre here is 6, so that's pretty common for T3. And the lot area tends to be 4,000 square feet, roughly 40 by 100. Coverage is about 60%, a lot of nice lawn, and the public frontage is a street. 76-foot right-of-way, 2 moving lanes, 2 parking lanes, so good residential street. 32 feet of pavement, like you can tell from the image. It's nice and tight. Vertical curb, 6-foot radius, really nice. The private frontage is interesting. There's a lot of fenced yards, and there are also there's a fair number of terraces, largely due to the topography, and you're going to see a lot of terraces in the Salt Lake area. 2 stories, 1-story outbuildings. They are served by alleys in this neighborhood, and they're all edge yards. And normally there's a range in the finished floor elevation of the first level, but generally the average is about 24 inches, although we did note some that were 36. So to look at that in Google, you can see it's nice and tight, lots of outbuildings. I don't know how many of these might actually be functioning accessory units. That could be bumping the number up a bit, but really a good T3 fabric. The sidewalk width is only 4 feet. That may be a little on the slim side again. Planter width is 12, so it might be, if they do streetscape improvements, to give a little of that over to additional sidewalk width would be a good idea. Tree types are various. It's a bike route, slow speeds, and column lighting at 12 feet, so it's really nice. Lot widths are 24 feet minimum, which is, like I mentioned earlier, nice and tight. Frontage built out is a very respectable 80%. The front setback is 12 feet, so it's not excessive. Although there were some that were more in the 20 to 30 range, but for the most part they're right at 12. And side setbacks of 5, along with rear. Ground level residential and upper level residential as well. So that gives you an overview of the areas that we'll be covering when we do our form-based code tables. And I recommend that you try to get, if you have Bento, you can actually get the app and go through it. We'll also be providing a PDF, so you'll be able to review this data prior to arrival. Check out the Google Maps and really zoom in and look at the parcelization, the aerials, and street view, because that'll give you a good sense of the context and what we'll be trying to replicate in our calibration efforts. So thanks again for joining us. We're really excited about it and looking forward to seeing you in Salt Lake.